The frigid wind sliced through Josephine Orwell's woolen coat as her wagon wheels ground to a screeching halt on the narrow mountain pass. The sudden lurch nearly threw her from her seat, the timber-laden wagon settling at a precarious angle against the rocky wall of the Bitterroot Mountains. The year was 1876, and she was alone, 3 days out from Fort Benton, Montana, with nothing but miles of wilderness between her and civilization. "No, no, not now," Josephine whispered, her breath forming clouds in the crisp autumn air. She climbed down from the wagon seat, her boots crunching on loose gravel as she examined the damage. The back axle had split clean through, and one wheel was bent beyond repair. Josephine ran her gloved hands through her auburn hair, pushing it back from her face as she surveyed the desolate landscape surrounding her. She had left Fort Benton with determination fueling her journey, her father's final will naming her the sole inheritor of his timber claim in the Montana Territory. At 26, she'd abandoned her teaching position in Chicago to claim what was rightfully hers, despite the warnings from her mother's friends about a woman traveling alone to such wild country. Now, as the late October sun dipped behind the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across the pass, she wondered if they had been right after all. A distant sound of hoofbeats echoed against the rock walls. Josephine's hand instinctively moved to the small revolver tucked in her coat pocket. The stories of road agents and outlaws were fresh in her mind from her short stay in Fort Benton. The rider appeared around the bend, a tall figure on a chestnut stallion. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a sheepskin coat, and worn leather chaps. His face was obscured by a thick beard, but his piercing blue eyes caught her attention immediately. "Seems you've got yourself in quite a predicament, madam," the man said, dismounting with fluid grace that belied his large frame. "The axle's broken," Josephine replied, keeping her hand near her pocket. "I don't suppose you know anything about wagon repairs," the stranger nodded, removing his hat to reveal thick dark hair with a streak of silver at the temples. "Xavier Calloway," he said, extending a weathered hand. "Most folks call me Zav." Josephine hesitated before taking his hand. "Josephine Orwell. I'm headed to my father's timber claim near Elkhorn Creek." Xavier circled the wagon, examining the damage with practiced eyes. "Mason Orwell's daughter heard he passed. My condolences." Josephine's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You knew my father?" Everyone around these parts knew Mason. Good man, fair in his dealings. Xavier knelt beside the broken axle. "This is beyond a simple fix, Miss Orwell. The axle's split clean through and that wheel won't roll true again." The realization sank like a stone in her stomach. "I don't suppose there's a Wainwright hidden behind these rocks." Xavier's laugh was unexpected, a rich sound that echoed off the mountainside. "Not exactly, but I've got tools and spare parts at my cabin. It's about 3 miles down this pass." Josephine glanced at the darkening sky, weighing her limited options. "And I'm to trust you, Mr. Calloway, a stranger I've just met on a deserted mountain pass. Trust isn't given freely in these parts, Miss Orwell. It's earned." Xavier stood to his full height, dusting off his hands. "I can leave you here with a broken wagon as night approaches, or I can help you. Your choice." The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of snow. Josephine shivered, making her decision. "Very well, Mr. Calloway, I accept your assistance." Xavier nodded, helping her secure her belongings and unhitch her team of horses. As they prepared to leave, he cast a final glance at the broken wagon. "I'll come back tomorrow with what we need. We'll get it fixed." "And then what?" Josephine asked, mounting the mare he'd offered her. Xavier's eyes met hers, something unreadable in their depths. "Then I'll follow you down. To your claim. Mason's land borders mine and winter's coming. You'll need help getting settled before the snow flies." Josephine wasn't sure if his words were a promise or a warning, but as they descended the mountain pass with the first snowflakes beginning to fall, she found herself grateful for his presence beside her. Xavier's cabin appeared as they rounded a bend in the trail, nestled among a stand of ponderosa pines. It was larger than Josephine had expected, constructed of sturdy logs with a stone chimney from which smoke curled lazily into the darkening sky. A corral stood to one side, housing several horses that nickered at their approach. "It's not much," Xavier said as he helped Josephine dismount, "but it's solid against the winter storms." "You built this yourself?" Josephine asked, stamping her feet to restore circulation after the cold ride. "With my own hands," he nodded, leading the horses to the corral. "Took 3 summers, but a man needs a proper place out here." Inside, the cabin was surprisingly comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, radiating warmth throughout the single room. A bed stood in one corner, covered with thick wool blankets and furs. A wooden table surrounded by 4 chairs occupied the center of the room, while shelves lined with books, tools, and provisions covered another wall. "You can take the bed," Xavier said, moving to stoke the fire. "I'll sleep by the hearth." Josephine stood awkwardly in the center of the room, suddenly very aware of her situation. She was alone in a cabin with a man she had just met, miles from any settlement. Yet something about Xavier Calloway inspired confidence rather than fear. "I can't displace you from your own bed, Mr. Calloway." "Zav," he corrected, hanging a kettle over the fire. "And you're not displacing me. My mother raised me better than to let a lady sleep on the floor." As the evening progressed, they shared a simple meal of venison stew and cornbread, and Josephine found herself drawn into conversation with her unexpected host. Xavier Calloway was unlike any man she had met before, direct in his speech, but never crude, knowledgeable about the territory but not boastful, and possessed of a quiet strength that seemed to fill the room. "How did you end up here?" she asked as they sat before the fire, cups of coffee warming their hands. "You don't strike me as someone running from the law." Xavier's laugh rumbled deep in his chest. "No, nothing like that. I came west after the war, couldn't settle back into Virginia life after what I'd seen." His eyes grew distant, focused on memories Josephine could only imagine. "Found this land 5 years ago. It spoke to me wild and honest in ways the East could never be." "And you've been alone all this time?" "Not alone. Got neighbors within a day's ride. Town's 3 days down when the weather's good." He studied her across the rim of his cup. "What about you, Miss Orwell? What brings a city woman to the wilderness?" Josephine traced the rim of her cup with one finger. "My father. We weren't close. He left when I was 12, headed west while my mother and I stayed in Chicago. I received letters occasionally, money sometimes. Then 3 months ago, a lawyer appeared with news of his death and a will naming me heir to his timber claim." "Most women would have sold the land without setting foot on it," Xavier observed. "I'm not most women," Josephine replied, lifting her chin slightly. "Besides, there was something in his last letter. He wrote that he had finally found a place worth putting down roots." "I wanted to see what he meant." Xavier nodded, respect evident in his expression. "Dawn comes early. We should rest if we're to recover your wagon tomorrow." That night, lying in Xavier's bed surrounded by the unfamiliar scents of pine, wood smoke, and leather, Josephine listened to his steady breathing across the room. The strangeness of her situation struck her fully: how quickly life could change, how a broken wagon could alter one's path entirely. Outside, snow fell silently, covering the mountain in a blanket of white, Morning arrived with brilliant sunlight reflecting off fresh snow. After a breakfast of flapjacks and coffee, Xavier loaded tools and a spare axle onto his pack horse. "Will this work for my wagon?" Josephine asked, eyeing the wooden axle. "It's meant for a smaller rig, but I can make adjustments," Xavier replied, securing the load. "It'll get you to your claim, at least." The journey back up the pass was arduous, the trail now covered in 6 inches of snow. Josephine marveled at how easily Xavier navigated the difficult terrain, his broad shoulders hunched against the cold, his eyes constantly scanning the path ahead. They reached the wagon by midday. Xavier immediately set to work, his movements efficient and purposeful. Josephine helped where she could, holding tools and steadying the wagon as he jacked it up to remove the broken wheel and axle. "How did you learn to do this?" she asked, watching as he skillfully shaved down the replacement axle to fit the wagon's specifications. "Necessity," he grunted, muscles straining as he worked. "Out here, a man either learns to fix what breaks or he doesn't survive long." Hours passed as Xavier worked, the sun crossing the sky and beginning its descent toward the western peaks. Finally, he stood, wiping his hands on a rag. "That should hold," he said, giving the repaired wheel a spin. "Not pretty, but it'll get you where you're going." Josephine felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Zav. I don't know what I would have done without your help." Xavier's weathered face softened momentarily. "We take care of our own out here. Your father was a good neighbor." As they hitched Josephine's team back to the wagon, she faced a decision. Daylight was fading, and attempting to navigate the unfamiliar trail to her claim would be foolish with night approaching. Xavier seemed to read her thoughts. "You should stay another night at my cabin. We can get an early start tomorrow." "I've imposed on your hospitality enough," Josephine protested weakly, though the thought of facing the mountain trails alone as darkness fell was daunting. "It's no imposition," Xavier said firmly. "Besides, I meant what I said. I'll follow you down to your claim, help you get settled." Josephine studied his face, searching for ulterior motives but finding only straightforward concern. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Xavier looked away, adjusting the horse's harnesses. "Winter's coming. Your father would have wanted someone looking out for his daughter." He paused, then added more softly, "And maybe I've been alone too long." That evening at the cabin, something shifted between them. Josephine helped prepare their meal, moving around the small space as if she belonged there. Xavier spoke more freely, telling stories of his encounters with bears, mountain lions, and the harsh Montana winters. In turn, Josephine shared tales of her life in Chicago, her years teaching school, and the complex relationship with her absent father. "He never explained why he left," Josephine said as they sat before the fire, the cabin cozy against the howling wind outside. "My mother said he couldn't stand being fenced in by city life, but I always wondered if there was more to it." Xavier stoked the fire thoughtfully. "Men sometimes run from what scares them most," he said. "Not bears or Indians, but feeling too much, needing someone too much." Their eyes met across the flames, and Josephine felt a curious tightening in her chest. Xavier Calloway was becoming something more than a helpful stranger. He was becoming a man she wanted to understand. The next morning they departed early, Xavier leading the way down the mountain pass on his stallion while Josephine followed in her wagon. The trail descended steadily, winding through forests of pine and fir, occasionally opening to reveal breathtaking vistas of the valley below. "Your father's claim is there," Xavier pointed as they paused at an overlook. "See that clearing by the creek? That's where he built his cabin." Josephine shielded her eyes, trying to make out the small structure nearly hidden among the trees. "It looks so small from here." "It's a good piece of land," Xavier assured her. Rich soil in the valley, timber on the slopes, and Elkhorn Creek never runs dry, even in August. By mid-afternoon, they had descended into the valley. Xavier guided them off the main trail onto a narrower path that followed Elkhorn Creek. The water rushed over rocks, still free of ice despite the chill in the air. "There it is," Xavier said as they rounded a bend. Mason Orwell's cabin stood in a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines. It was a simple structure, smaller than Xavier's but solidly built, with a stone chimney and a covered porch across the front. A lean-to stable stood nearby, and behind the cabin, Josephine could see where her father had cleared land for a garden. Emotion welled unexpectedly as Josephine brought the wagon to a halt before her inheritance. This was the place her father had chosen over his family, the place he had loved more than he had loved her and her mother. "Are you all right?" Xavier asked, noticing her expression. "Yes," Josephine said, quickly wiping away a tear. "It's just strange to see where he lived, where he died." Xavier dismounted and offered his hand to help her down from the wagon. "He died peacefully, if that's any comfort, in his sleep. I found him when he didn't show up for our monthly game of checkers." The interior of the cabin was clean but sparse: a bed, a table with 2 chairs, a small stove, and shelves holding basic provisions. Mason's personal belongings were few: some clothes, a razor, a Bible, and a small wooden box that Josephine recognized from her childhood. "He kept this," she whispered, opening the box to find a collection of her childhood drawings, letters from her mother, and a daguerreotype of the 3 of them taken before he left. Xavier busied himself lighting the stove and bringing in firewood, giving her privacy to explore her father's last home. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "I'll stay the night," Xavier said as he returned with an armload of wood. "Make sure everything's in order before I head back to my place." Josephine nodded, grateful for his continued presence as the reality of her isolation began to sink in. That night, they shared another meal, this time in her father's cabin. Xavier pointed out the improvements Mason had made over the years: the well-seasoned logs that wouldn't shrink and let in drafts, the carefully constructed chimney that drew smoke properly, the root cellar beneath the floor where vegetables could be stored through winter. "He was preparing for someone," Xavier said quietly. "The last year he was expanding everything: the garden, the stable, adding shelves, building a second bed." He met Josephine's gaze. "I think he was hoping you might come someday." The thought brought fresh tears to Josephine's eyes. "He never asked. In all his letters he described this place, but he never once asked me to visit." "Some men find it harder to ask for what they want most," Xavier said, his voice gentle. That night, Xavier slept on a bedroll near the stove while Josephine took her father's bed. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as she listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness: the hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a wolf, the creaking of the cabin as it settled in the cold. In the morning, Xavier showed her the essential tasks for survival: how to keep the fire burning efficiently, where her father had stored split wood, how to draw water from the creek using the path he had worn through daily use. "The nearest neighbors are the Hendersons, about 5 miles downriver," Xavier explained as they stood on the porch, surveying the property in the clear morning light. "Good people. They'll help if you need it." "And you?" Josephine asked, turning to face him. "How far is your cabin from here?" "About 3 hours' ride," Xavier replied. "Less if the weather's good and I push my horse." Josephine nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. She had grown accustomed to his presence in just 3 days, finding comfort in his quiet strength and practical knowledge. "I should get back," Xavier said, though he made no move to leave. "Got my own place to prepare for winter." Of course, Josephine said quickly. You've already done more than enough. Xavier studied her face, then looked away across the valley. I meant what I said on the mountain pass. I'll follow you down, check on you, make sure you're managing. I don't need charity, Mr. Calloway, Josephine said, stiffening slightly. It's not charity, Miss Orwell, Xavier replied, a hint of frustration in his voice. It's being a good neighbor. It's what people do out here. We look out for each other. Their eyes met, and the tension between them crackled like the fire in the stove. For a moment, Josephine thought he might say more, but instead, Xavier donned his hat and moved toward his horse. I'll be back in a week, he said, swinging into the saddle. Sooner if the weather turns. Josephine watched him ride away, his broad shoulders straight, his horse's hooves leaving tracks in the light dusting of snow. Only when he disappeared into the trees did she acknowledge the emptiness his departure created. The first 3 days alone at the cabin passed in a blur of activity. Josephine cleaned every surface, organized her father's belongings, and explored the immediate surroundings. She discovered Mason's journal in a drawer beside his bed and spent evenings reading his entries by lamplight, learning about the man her father had become in the wilderness. On the 4th day, snow began to fall steadily. By morning, nearly a foot covered the ground, transforming the landscape into a glistening white expanse. Josephine found herself watching the trail more often, wondering if Xavier would keep his promise to return. On the 6th day, as she was chopping kindling beside the cabin, the sound of hoofbeats made her heart leap. Xavier appeared from the trees, his horse plowing through the deep snow, his broad shoulders dusted with white. Thought you might need these, he called, holding up a burlap sack. Fresh supplies from town. Josephine couldn't hide her smile as he dismounted. I was managing just fine, Mr. Calloway. Never doubted it for a minute, Miss Orwell, he replied, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. But coffee tastes better when it's fresh, and I figured you might be running low. Inside the cabin, Xavier looked around approvingly at the changes Josephine had made. She had hung curtains fashioned from fabric found in her father's trunk, arranged her books on the shelf, and brought order to what had been a bachelor's sparse quarters. Looks like a proper home now, he commented, removing his heavy coat. It's getting there, Josephine agreed, pouring coffee into 2 cups. I found my father's journals. He wrote about you. Xavier accepted the coffee, raising an eyebrow. Oh, nothing too incriminating, I hope. He called you the most honest man I've met in the territory, Josephine said, watching Xavier's reaction. Said you were stubborn as a mule but true as steel. A faint flush colored Xavier's weathered cheeks. Mason had a way with words. They spent the day together, Xavier helping with tasks that required strength Josephine lacked, splitting logs for the woodpile, patching a small leak in the root cellar, showing her how to properly maintain the stove for maximum heat. As evening approached, snow began falling again, heavy and wet. Xavier stood at the window, frowning at the darkening sky. I should head back before it gets worse, he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Josephine joined him at the window, watching the thick flakes swirl in the wind. That would be foolish, and you know it. The trail will be invisible within the hour. Their eyes met in the reflection on the glass, and something unspoken passed between them. Xavier nodded once, accepting the logic of her words even as they both acknowledged the impropriety of the situation. I'll sleep in the stable, he said firmly. Don't be ridiculous, Josephine replied. It's freezing out there. You'll take the bedroll by the stove as you did before. That night, as the storm raged outside, they sat before the fire talking until the late hours. Xavier told her about his life before Montana, his childhood in Virginia, his reluctant service in the Confederate Army, his aimless wandering afterward, seeking something he couldn't name until he found these mountains. "What about you?" he asked, his voice soft in the firelit room. "What are you running from?" Josephine considered denying it, but something in his perceptive gaze stopped her. "Expectations," she admitted. "In Chicago, I was Mason Orwell's abandoned daughter, the poor spinster schoolteacher that everyone pitied. I thought coming here might let me discover who I really am, apart from all that. And have you discovered who you are?" Josephine smiled, looking around at the cabin that was slowly becoming hers. "I'm beginning to." The storm lasted 3 days, trapping them together in the small cabin. They fell into a comfortable routine. Xavier, venturing out to care for the horses and bring in wood. Josephine cooking meals and reading aloud from her father's journals in the evenings. They learned each other's habits, preferences, and moods with surprising ease, as if they had known each other far longer than a mere week. On the morning of the 4th day, they awoke to brilliant sunshine reflecting off the pristine snow. The storm had passed, leaving nearly 3 feet of fresh powder covering the landscape. "I should head back," Xavier said as they stood on the porch after breakfast. "Got my own place to see to." Josephine nodded, feeling a strange reluctance to see him go. "Of course. I've kept you too long already." Xavier turned to her, his blue eyes serious. "I'll be back in 2 weeks, sooner if another storm threatens. You don't need to keep checking on me, Xav, I'm managing." "I know you are," he said with unexpected gentleness. "Maybe I'm not coming for your sake." The implication of his words lingered between them as he saddled his horse and prepared to leave. Josephine watched him from the porch, wrapped in her shawl against the cold. "Be careful on the trails," she called as he mounted. "The snow will have changed them." Xavier touched his hat brim in acknowledgement. "I'll follow the creek up. It's the surest path." As he rode away, Josephine felt the silence of the wilderness close around her once more, yet this time it felt different, not threatening, but full of possibility. 2 weeks, she thought. She could manage 2 weeks. The days passed in a rhythm of work and solitude. Josephine explored her property further, discovering the boundaries Mason had marked with blazes on trees. She found a small stream that joined Elkhorn Creek near the edge of her claim, a perfect spot for summer washing, she thought, already planning for seasons ahead. In the evenings, she continued reading her father's journals, learning about his struggles and triumphs in this wild country. One entry, dated 3 years earlier, caught her attention particularly. "Calloway rode over today. Helped me raise the roof beam on the expanded cabin. Never asked why I needed more space, but I think he knows I'm hoping Josephine might come someday. A man gets tired of being alone with his regrets. Wish I'd had the courage to ask her years ago, but perhaps it's not too late." Tears blurred Josephine's vision as she read the words. Her father had wanted her here after all, had been preparing a place for her, but had never found the courage to ask directly. The realization both healed and hurt in equal measure. True to his word, Xavier returned exactly 2 weeks later, this time bringing not just supplies but also letters that had arrived for Josephine at the Fort Benton post office. One was from her mother, expressing concern about her welfare and imploring her to return to Chicago before winter set in completely. "Will you go back?" Xavier asked as Josephine folded the letter and set it aside. They sat at the table, sharing a meal of rabbit stew Josephine had prepared. Outside, the early December darkness had fallen, but inside, lamplight created a warm glow. "No," Josephine said with quiet certainty. "This is where I belong now." Xavier's expression remained neutral, but Josephine noticed how his shoulders relaxed slightly at her words. "Winter's hard here," he cautioned. "Harder than anything you've known in the city." "I'm learning," Josephine said. "Besides, I have a good neighbor who seems determined to keep me alive." Xavier's rare smile transformed his face, softening the lines around his eyes. "You'd manage fine without me, Miss Orwell." "Perhaps," she replied, meeting his gaze across the table. "But I'm glad I don't have to." That visit established a pattern. Every 2 weeks, weather permitting, Xavier would ride down from his cabin to check on Josephine. Sometimes he stayed only hours, other times overnight if storms threatened. Each visit deepened their connection, their conversations ranging from practical matters of survival to philosophical discussions that lasted late into the night. December gave way to January, bringing the bitter cold of deep winter. The snow piled higher, making travel between their properties increasingly difficult. During one particularly harsh cold snap, Xavier arrived unexpectedly, concern evident in his face. "Thermometer at my place showed 30 below this morning," he said as he stomped snow from his boots on the porch. "Wanted to make sure your stove was keeping up." Josephine welcomed him inside, touched by his concern. "I've been feeding it constantly, just as you showed me." "The cabin's holding heat well." Xavier nodded approvingly, removing his heavy coat and gloves. His fingers were red and stiff from the cold despite his thick leather gloves. Without thinking, Josephine took his hands between hers, rubbing them gently to restore circulation. Xavier went still at her touch, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a long moment, they stood thus, connected by the simple touch of hands, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Josephine released him first, stepping back with a self-conscious smile. "You should warm up by the fire. I'll make coffee." That evening, as they sat before the fire, Xavier cleared his throat. "Been meaning to ask you something, Miss Orwell." "Josephine," she corrected gently. "After all this time, I think you can use my given name." Xavier nodded, staring into the flames. "Josephine, then." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Spring will be here before we know it. You'll need to plant a garden if you're staying." "I am staying," she confirmed. "Good." Another pause. "I was thinking. My cabin gets the morning sun, but it's sheltered from the worst winds. Your place here catches the afternoon light, and the creek never freezes at that bend just beyond your stable." Josephine waited, sensing he was working his way toward something important. "What I mean to say is," Xavier continued, his voice gruff, "a man and a woman could do well with both properties, working them together." Josephine's heart quickened. "Are you proposing a business arrangement, Mr. Calloway?" Xavier finally looked at her, his blue eyes serious in the firelight. "I'm proposing whatever you'd be willing to consider, Josephine. I've grown fond of our visits, more than fond." The simple honesty of his words moved her deeply. This man, so capable and self-sufficient, was offering her not just partnership but the vulnerability of his heart. "I've grown fond of them too," Josephine replied softly, "more than I expected to." Xavier's expression lightened with hope. "I'm not asking for promises, just consideration for what might be possible between us come spring." "Spring feels very far away right now," Josephine said, watching the snow falling outside the window. "It always does," Xavier agreed. "But it comes, sure as sunrise." That night, as Xavier slept on his bedroll near the stove, Josephine lay awake in her bed, turning his words over in her mind. She had come to Montana seeking independence, a chance to forge her own path away from the constraints of Chicago society. She hadn't expected to find a man like Xavier Calloway, a man whose strength matched her own, whose presence enhanced rather than diminished her newfound freedom. January stretched into February, each day marked by the struggle against winter's grip. During one visit, Xavier taught Josephine to use snowshoes, leading her through the forest surrounding her cabin. The world transformed under its blanket of white was magical sun sparkling on untouched drifts, animal tracks telling stories of nighttime journeys, icicles hanging like crystal decorations from evergreen boughs. "It's beautiful," Josephine breathed, turning in a slow circle to take in the scene. Xavier watched her, his expression soft. "Yes, it is." She caught his gaze and realized he wasn't looking at the landscape. Heat rose to her cheeks despite the cold air. "We should head back," Xavier said after a moment. Storm clouds gathering to the west. As they trudged back toward the cabin, following their own tracks through the deep snow, Josephine stumbled on a hidden branch. Xavier caught her arm, steadying her, but the momentum brought them close together, her hands braced against his chest. Time seemed to pause as they stood thus, breath mingling in white clouds between them. Xavier's hand moved to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite his calloused fingers. "Josephine," he whispered, her name a question on his lips. She answered by closing the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that started tentative but quickly deepened with shared desire. Xavier's arms encircled her, drawing her against the solid warmth of his body as the kiss continued, unhurried and thorough. When they finally parted, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since I found you on that mountain pass," he admitted. Josephine smiled, her heart full. "I'm glad you waited. It means more now." The following weeks brought them closer still. Xavier began staying longer during his visits, and the pretense of sleeping separately gradually faded. In the quiet darkness of her cabin, they explored each other with wonder and growing passion, learning the language of touch and taste that needed no words. By early March, the first signs of spring began to appear: longer days, patches of ground emerging from melting snow, the return of birdsong to the trees. The topic of their future, left open since Xavier's careful suggestion in January, resurfaces as the season changed. "I've been thinking about what you said," Josephine told him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered mountains with rose and gold, "about working both properties together." Xavier turned to her, his expression carefully neutral. "And I want to keep this cabin," Josephine said. "It's my father's legacy to me, but I've grown to love your place too. The way the morning sun comes through the windows, the view from that ridge behind the corral." Hope kindled in Xavier's eyes. "Are you saying what I think you're saying, Josephine?" She took his hand, twining her fingers with his. "I'm saying I want both. The independence I came here seeking and the partnership we've found together. Is that possible?" Xavier brought her hand to his lips, kissing her fingers one by one. "With you, I'm beginning to believe anything is possible." The next morning, Xavier surprised her by producing a small wooden box from his saddlebag. Inside lay a simple gold band with a small pearl set in the center. "Belonged to my grandmother," he explained as Josephine stared at it in wonder. "My mother gave it to me before I left Virginia. Said I should save it for when I found a woman strong enough to stand beside me, not behind me." Tears filled Josephine's eyes as Xavier took her hand. "Josephine Orwell, will you marry me? Share my life, my land, my future." "I know I'm not a wealthy man. You're everything I never knew I wanted," Josephine interrupted, cradling his weathered face between her palms. "Yes, Xavier Calloway, I will marry you." As the snow continued to melt, revealing the green promise of spring beneath, they made plans. The circuit preacher would visit Fort Benton in May. They would marry then, with the Hendersons and other neighbors as witnesses. They would divide their time between both properties, expanding Xavier's cabin for their permanent home while maintaining Josephine's as a place for storage and guests. "And children?" Xavier asked one night as they lay together, his hand resting protectively over her stomach. "Would you want that someday? Josephine covered his hand with hers. "I would. Not right away, perhaps. But yes, I want children who will know the freedom of these mountains, who will learn strength and honesty from their father." Xavier's kiss was tender. "And wisdom and courage from their mother." By late April, the transformation of the land was complete. The last patches of snow clung only to shaded north-facing slopes and high mountain passes. The creek ran full with snowmelt, and everywhere green shoots pushed through rich, dark soil. Josephine began her garden, planting seeds Xavier had procured from Fort Benton during a supply run. One bright morning, as they worked together turning soil for the potato bed, Josephine paused, leaning on her shovel. "What is it?" Xavier asked, noting her thoughtful expression. "I was just thinking about that day on the mountain pass," Josephine said. "How different my life would be if my wagon hadn't broken down or if someone else had found me there." Xavier straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "Do you believe in fate, Josephine?" She considered the question seriously. "I'm not sure. But I do believe some things are meant to be, however they come about." She smiled at him, this man who had become the center of her world. "Like us." Xavier crossed to her, taking her hands in his dirt-stained ones. "Your wagon breaking down was the luckiest moment of my life," he said simply. "And I meant what I said that day. I'll follow you anywhere. Even when we're old and gray," Josephine teased. "Especially then," Xavier promised, sealing his words with a kiss that tasted of spring earth and new beginnings. Their wedding day dawned clear and bright, the first week of May bringing perfect weather to Fort Benton. The small church was filled with neighbors and townspeople who had come to witness the union of Xavier Calloway and Josephine Orwell. The Hendersons had insisted on hosting a celebration afterward at their ranch, and wagons lined the street outside the church. Josephine wore a simple dress of pale blue silk that she had ordered from Chicago, arriving just days before the ceremony. Xavier, uncomfortable in his best shirt and newly purchased suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him down the short aisle. The preacher's words were traditional, but the promises Xavier and Josephine made to each other carried the weight of their unique journey from strangers meeting on a snowy mountain pass to partners in all things. "I take you as my wife," Xavier said, his voice steady and sure. "To stand beside through winter storms and summer heat, through good harvests and poor, through all the seasons of our lives together." Josephine's voice trembled slightly as she responded, "I take you as my husband, the man who fixed my broken wagon and followed me down into a new life. I promise to walk beside you always, partner in all things, lover, friend, and companion for all our days." As they exchanged rings, Xavier's grandmother's pearl for Josephine and a simple gold band for him, the preacher pronounced them husband and wife. Xavier's kiss was gentle, but carried a promise of the private celebration they would share later, away from watchful eyes. The gathering at the Henderson Ranch lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and more food than Josephine had seen since leaving Chicago. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Xavier found her sitting alone on the porch, watching the celebration continue without them. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Calloway?" he asked, offering his hand. The name still sounded new to her ears, but right in her heart. "Home," she repeated, smiling up at him. "Which one, yours or mine?" Xavier pulled her to her feet and into his arms. "Ours," he corrected. "All of it, the land, the cabins, the future, ours together." They spent their wedding night in the town's small hotel, a luxury compared to their cabins, with a real bathtub and a feather mattress. But the next morning, both were eager to return to their mountain home, to begin their life together properly in the place that had brought them together. As they drove their wagon up the familiar trail that followed Elkhorn Creek, Josephine leaned against Xavier's solid shoulder, contentment filling her heart. The broken wagon axle that had seemed such a disaster 6 months earlier had led her not just down a mountain pass, but into a love and partnership she had never imagined possible. "What are you thinking?" Xavier asked, his arm secure around her waist as he guided the horses with his free hand. Josephine smiled up at him, the man who had become her husband, her partner, her heart. "I'm thinking that sometimes the best journeys begin with a breakdown on a mountain pass." Xavier's laugh echoed off the canyon walls. "And sometimes," he added, pressing a kiss to her temple, "the best promises are the ones that say, 'I'll follow you down.'" As they rounded the final bend, their cabin came into view, nestled among the pines just as it had been on that first day. But now it was transformed in Josephine's eyes, no longer her father's legacy alone, but the beginning of their shared future. A home they would build together through all the seasons of their lives to come. Years passed, the rhythm of their lives following the cycles of nature in the Montana wilderness. Their first child, a son they named William, was born the following spring, his lusty cries filling their expanded cabin with new life and purpose. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later, her arrival during a summer thunderstorm, a fitting introduction for a girl who would grow to have her mother's spirit and her father's steady strength. Xavier expanded their holdings, purchasing adjacent land when neighbors decided to move on, until the Calloway ranch stretched across a significant portion of the valley. Josephine's garden grew as well, supplying not only their family but producing enough to trade with townspeople and neighboring ranchers. Her preserves and pickles became known throughout the territory for their quality, bringing in extra income during winter months. As the children grew, so did the settlement along Elkhorn Creek. What had once been wilderness gradually transformed into a small community, with a schoolhouse built on land donated by Xavier and Josephine. Josephine returned to teaching, sharing her knowledge with not only her own children but those of neighbors and newcomers alike. Through it all, through harsh winters and dry summers, through the challenges of raising children in the wilderness and the everyday struggles of ranch life, the foundation of their partnership remained strong. The love that had begun on a snowy mountain pass deepened and matured, becoming as essential to their survival as water from the creek or heat from their stove. On their 10th anniversary, Xavier surprised Josephine by taking her back to the mountain pass where they had first met. The trail was wider now, more traveled, but the view from the overlook remained as breathtaking as it had been that October day a decade earlier. "You ever regret it?" Xavier asked as they stood together, looking out across the valley that had become their home. "Leaving Chicago. Taking a chance on a broken wagon and a bearded stranger." Josephine's laugh was warm as she leaned against his solid strength. "Not for a single moment," she assured him, turning in his arms to look up into the face that had become as familiar to her as her own. Lines had formed at the corners of his eyes. Silver had replaced the dark streak in his hair, but his gaze still held the same steadfast devotion it had on their wedding day. "Even when the winter storms come and the roof leaks and the children are sick all at once." Xavier pressed, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Even then," Josephine confirmed, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. "Especially then." As they made their way back down the mountain pass, following the trail that had brought them together, Josephine reflected on the unpredictable paths life could take. A broken wagon axle, a stranger's kindness, a promise to follow her down, these simple things had changed the course of her life completely, bringing her to a happiness deeper and more lasting than anything she could have imagined in her previous life. "What are you smiling about?" Xavier asked, his hand warm around hers as they walked their horses side by side down the familiar trail. Josephine squeezed his fingers, her heart full. "I was just thinking that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a simple breakdown." Xavier's answering smile held all the love and promise of their years together and all those still to come. "And sometimes," he added, echoing words spoken long ago, "the greatest journeys are the ones we take together." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across their path, Josephine and Xavier continued their journey home, hand in hand, just as they had done every day since that fateful meeting on the mountain pass. Partners, lovers, friends, following each other down whatever paths life might bring.